The Jets have everything they need to be a surprise team this season, and the Jets have everything they need to be a disappointment this season. Locked On Jets begins now.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, July 29th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Our episode today is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Well, there are real reasons for optimism around the New York Jets in 2025. You may not hear a lot of them from the national media, but this is a Jets team that has a number of strengths. However, this is also a Jets team that has some pretty pronounced weaknesses. And on today's show, we're going to talk about reasons to believe this season could go well for the Jets and reasons to believe the season could go poorly. And ultimately, we're going to talk about the things that will decide which of the two paths the Jets will take this year. I don't think in the NFL that most teams' final destinies are predetermined. I think we have it in our mindset that a team that's good was always going to be good, or a team that's bad was always going to be bad. And with only a handful of exceptions, I don't think that that's really true. Now, look, of course, we know Kansas City is going to be good every year. You know, the Kansas City Chiefs are always going to be good as long as Patrick Mahomes stays healthy. And there are some very bad teams this year who, really don't have much going for them that, aren't going to go anywhere. So I think at the very top and the very bottom, you kind of know which teams are going to be good and which teams are going to be bad. But most of the NFL is the middle class. And in the middle class, there's a very, very small difference between the teams. The difference between a 10-7 season and a 7-10 season, very small. It could come down to a couple bounces of the ball. It could come down to a couple injuries. It could come down to a couple decisions a coach makes. And when I look at this New York Jets team, I don't see a team that really has a great shot at making a deep run in the playoffs. Of course, anything can happen, but I'm not expecting the Jets to be a team that's competing deep into January. But I'm also not expecting a team that will be picking in the top 5 of the NFL draft. And I think that a lot of the pessimism around this Jets team isn't really about the roster the Jets have right now. It's not really about the team the Jets have right now. It's about the team. It's about the history, because this is a team that's disappointed year after year after year. They were one of the biggest disappointments in recent NFL history the last 2 years. I mean, 2023, 2024, Jets were getting Super Bowl buzz this time of year. Now, in 2023, of course, they lost a quarterback 4 plays into the season. So if you want to make an excuse, it's pretty easy to do. But last year, they had the quarterback the full season. They had a bunch of big offseason acquisitions, and it simply did not work. And one of the things I've complained about on this show over the last 2 years is that the Jets had a good core. And the good news is the Jets still have that core. And my belief is that the Jets should have spent the last 2 years building around that core. And when we talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the current Jets roster, in many ways, they're a reflection of the strengths and weaknesses of the previous GM, Joe Douglas, because Douglas brought a lot of the pieces onto this team. And when Douglas inherited the Jets roster in 2019, there were very few good players. There was one high-end player in Jamal Adams. And then there was there was another good player at the safety position in Marcus May. And if you went down the roster, you sprinkled, there were a few decent players sprinkled in, but there was really not a great base of talent. Well, what did Joe Douglas do? Joe Douglas came in, he made a trade involving Jamal Adams early in his tenure, which netted the Jets 2 first-round picks, which turned into 2 very good players, Garrett Wilson and Elijah Vera Tucker. And you look across this Jets roster, and most of the players who are good on this team right now, and the Jets have a number of good players, were guys who were drafted by Joe Douglas, not guys who were signed by Joe Douglas, not really a lot of guys who were traded for by Joe Douglas. Most of the good players were drafted by Joe Douglas. And, speaking about the strengths and weaknesses of Joe Douglas, I think one of the reasons the Jets failed the last 2 years was they kind of got away from something that was working for them. If you look at the team in 2021 and 2022, even considering they missed on the quarterback number 2 overall in 2021 and Zach Wilson, the Jets added an awful lot of good pieces in those 2 drafts. 2021, you missed on the quarterback second overall, and that's a franchise-altering pick. Whether it goes right or wrong, when you draft a quarterback 2 overalls, it's a franchise-altering pick. And in many ways, the mistakes that followed with Douglas the last 2 years were a consequence of Douglas missing on the second overall pick in 2021 on Zach Wilson. But that 2021 draft class brought the Jets Elijah Vera Tucker, it brought them Jamie and Sherwood, and it brought them Michael Carter II. 3 guys who have turned into good starters. And it's kind of weird to say that a class that where you missed on a quarterback second overall was actually pretty decent. And also a class where you missed on a wide receiver with a high second round pick, because the Jets drafted Elijah Moore on the high second round. He ended up being a bust. But despite that, the Jets ended up getting 3 guys who were pretty good starters. And then 2022 came around. And that was, of course, the epic draft class that brought us Garrett Wilson and Sauce Gardner and Jermaine Johnson and Breece Hall. And suddenly, like, this Jets roster has pieces. And you add that to Quinnen Williams, the last of the good players Mike Maccagnan brought in. Quinnen Williams was a player Douglas inherited. It was Maccagnan's final first-round pick. Maccagnan was obviously not a great GM, and that would be an understatement. Maccagnan was one of the worst GMs in recent memory any team has had. But Maccagnan did get the Jets Quinnen Williams. And the point that I think needs to be made is when you've got players of this caliber, we've got Quinnen Williams, Sauce Gardner, Garrett Wilson, 3 guys who I think you could call bona fide stars. And then you sprinkle in other guys who are pretty good starters, Breece Hall. Breece Hall could elevate his game this year, and that would be great for the Jets. Elijah Vera Tucker. You want to talk Jamie and Sherwood on the defensive side of the ball. Carter. You can even go with Douglas's last couple first-round picks. You want to talk Olu Fashanu. You want to talk Will McDonald. We could go to the second round in 2023, Joe Tippmann. Lots of good players that Joe Douglas drafted in the early rounds, and they comprise the core of this team now. And what I'll say is that when you've got this many quality players, you've got a shot. Now, the Jets still don't have enough quality players to be a Super Bowl team. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But when you've got this many quality players, it's tough to be really, really bad. Unless you're in a situation last year like the 2024 Jets, where you just had all the wrong pieces. You had the wrong coaches. You had the wrong personalities in the locker room. You had a bunch of big names that didn't really come together as a team. But that's changed this year. We've talked about this. We talked about it on yesterday's show, how things seem different this year. And the Jets now have a core of talent, which is not something you would have said at any other point during this 14-year drought, missing the playoffs. And for me, that makes this Jets team different. It means that this is not the Jets of Adam Gase. This is not the Jets of Todd Bowles. This is not the Jets of John Idzik. It's not the Jets of Mike Maccagnan. It's not the Jets of the last couple of years of Tannenbaum. Mike Tannenbaum had some good years at the beginning, but it's not the Jets of the last couple of years of Mike Tannenbaum. There's a real core here. And Joe Douglas was not a perfect GM. We're going to dive into that in just a bit. But Joe Douglas, I would say, is probably the first GM the Jets have had since Bill Parcells, who left the team in better shape than he found it. And, you could say, well, that was a low bar, but you know what? It was a low bar for John Idzik. John Idzik didn't do it. It was a low bar for Mike Maccagnan. Mike Maccagnan didn't do it. Joe Douglas, to his credit, hit on some picks. And the picks he hit on have given the Jets a chance to have a good season. Now, during the Locked On Jets podcast, well, we've praised Joe Douglas. And as I said, I think that this team, in many ways, both its strengths and weaknesses are a reflection of the strengths and weaknesses of the former GM, because he was with the team till last year. He brought a lot of these players in. We've talked about the strengths, but there's one big weakness Joe Douglas had, and it really hurt the team's ability to build depth. And I'll tell you what that weakness is as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. We've all been there logging in early and waiting forever for concert tickets to go on sale, only to lose your spot for a show you've been dying to see. Live music should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping. And that's where Gametime comes in. Gametime makes getting concert tickets faster and easier than ever. Prices actually drop the closer it gets to showtime, and you can save up to 60% with their killer last-minute deals. I've used Gametime on many occasions. It's not just concerts. You can get theater, comedy, sports, you name it. You want to go see the Jets in September or October, Gametime's the place to get in on the action. I get amazing deals and all-in pricing, so There's no surprises when you check out. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. We're talking about the 2025 New York Jets today. This is a team that has more talent than a lot of people think. And it's a team that actually has higher odds of being successful this year than a lot of people think. But this is a Jets team that kind of has some weaknesses. And I think the number one weakness the New York Jets have right now is depth. And we tend to only think about depth in terms of backup players. If your starting corner goes down, who's the guy that's going to step in for him? So who's the backup who becomes a starter? But that's only one element of depth. And there's another really important element of depth, because let's say, I don't even want to raise this idea, but let's say something happens to Sauce Gardner. Well, the guy that goes in who replaces him in the starting lineup is not going to be the number one corner. You want to have a solid number two corner who'll be able to slide into the number one role. So, for example, the last couple of years, if Sauce Gardner had gotten hurt, DJ Reed would have been able to slide into the number one role. He would have been the number one corner. And you would have felt pretty good with DJ Reed as your number one corner. It wouldn't be as good as Sauce Gardner. And it wouldn't be as good as having Sauce Gardner as your number one and DJ as your number two. But that's something you could live with at the wide receiver position. If you have a number one receiver, he goes down, your number two receiver slides into that number one role. And that's a spot where the Jets could be in a lot of trouble at wide receiver, because Garrett Wilson's a very, very solid number one receiver. He'd be the number one receiver. He's the number one receiver for the Jets. He'd be a number one receiver, probably half the teams in the league, if not more. But if anything happens to Garrett Wilson, Jets are in a world of trouble at the wide receiver spot, because who's going to be the number one receiver? Is it going to be Josh Reynolds? I mean, Josh Reynolds has not even really performed at the level of a number two receiver. I think you look at the defensive line, Quinn and Williams. You're talking about the top three players on the Jets, the three players I referred to as stars earlier. You've got Quinnen, you've got Sauce, and you've got Garrett. And if anything happens to Quinnen, again, the Jets don't really have another guy who can be the lead defensive tackle on this team. And you look across the roster, there really is a genuine lack of depth. And at the corner position, the Jets lost some depth because DJ Reed departed in free agency for the Detroit Lions. Brandon Stevens is in. Let me tell you something. You can like Brandon Stevens, but you're not going to have the same confidence in Brandon Stevens playing the other team's number one receiver that you would have in DJ Reed. And you look across this roster, there's a real lack of depth. And I think that this speaks to, again, something Joe Douglas did wrong. In the first time we talked about the stuff Joe Douglas did right, and his early round drafting was pretty good. It's really tough to criticize his early round drafting, aside from the fact, and this is no small aside from the fact he missed on the quarterback second overall in 2021. And that was a big deal. But he actually hit on most of his early picks. He gave this team a very good base of talent. And that's the base of talent that could lift this team to better things. But if you want a reason where the Jets could be held back, well, it could be the lack of depth. And one thing Douglas did over and over that I felt was not well advised was selling off his later round picks, particularly his day 3 draft picks. And, whenever you trade a day 3 draft pick, people are like, oh, who cares? It's just a day 3 pick. Well, the thing about that is giving up one day 3 pick is not a big deal, because odds are against you hitting on a day 3 pick. But you have to be able to find cheap players who can contribute for your team. And those are the guys you find on day 3 of the draft. Douglas was not a great day 3 guy. In his tenure with the Jets, really the only guys he got who ended up being good starters on day 3 were Michael Carter II and Jamian Sherwood. And Sherwood was only a starter 1 year on his 4-year rookie contract. So Sherwood really only gave you 1 year of cost-controlled, high-caliber play. You want to talk undrafted free agents. I mean, Tony Adams, I guess, is a passable safety, but he's not that great. Bryce Huff was an excellent situational pass rusher, but he was not a 3-down player. over and over, the Jets traded day 3 picks. I mean, sometimes they do it for players that they didn't really need. I mean, they traded Joe Douglas in his first year, traded a late round pick for Nate Hairston, a corner who really couldn't cover anybody. He traded, he traded day 3 picks for guys frequently. He also traded up a lot in the draft. And this speaks to another issue with Joe Douglas, is that for a guy who learned from Ozzie Newsome, he was very Ozzie Newsome-like when he drafted. The Baltimore Ravens were famous for working the compensatory pick system and adding extra draft picks. The Ravens are a team that really load up on, especially when you're talking like late day 2, early day 3 picks, rounds 3, 4, 5. The Ravens love to load up on picks in those areas. If you look at Baltimore, they don't hit on a lot of the picks. I mean, they hit on a very low percentage of the picks. The thing is, they have so many though, that even a low percentage means you get a lot of good players out of it. Unfortunately, Joe Douglas has always felt like he had a very small draft board when he was running the Jets, where there were only a handful of players the Jets wanted. Now, to be fair, that's actually similar to the way the Baltimore Ravens operate. The difference was Ozzie Newsome always wanted, even though Ozzie Newsome may have had a small draft board, he wanted to get as many of the guys on his small draft board as he could. Whereas Douglas would target like specific guys. And the ultimate example of that would be Malachi Corley, who very well may have fallen to the Jets if they just stayed put in the 3rd round. The Jets were trying to trade up high into the 2nd round last year for a guy who's a huge question mark at this point. And the one thing that Ozzie Newsome always was in the NFL draft was he was a guy who gave himself a margin for error. Ozzie Newsome was smart enough to realize, I may get some of these evaluations wrong. So I want to have extra picks. I want to build in a margin for error. Whereas Joe Douglas was always very confident in his moves. Again, lots of trade ups, lots of picks sent out for veteran guys who did not really help. And I think that if you look at the overall depth or lack of depth on this roster right now, it goes back to the way Douglas handled those late round picks. And, over the last couple of years, I mean, he's also sent a number of early picks out. Jets sent 2 second round picks to Green Bay for Aaron Rodgers, and they would have sent a 1st round pick if Rodgers had not gotten hurt in 2023. They sent 3rd round picks out for Devontae Adams and Hassan Reddick. Neither of them worked that great. I mean, at least Adams played well. Reddick, barely played at all. But those moves did not really work out. And this is really when this is the point where a couple drafts later, you really start to feel the impact of losing picks, particularly in that range, like rounds 3 through 5, and it's left the Jets in a really tough spot when it comes to depth, because this is a Jets team that, while it has good pieces, really can't afford injuries, particularly to their best players. So that's, when you look at the Jets roster, we can list the good players, and that's a good thing, because there have been many Jets years in recent memory where the Jets have had nobody who's good. That's not the case anymore. This is a Jets team that has a number of quality starters, but are there enough? Are there enough to weather the attrition of an NFL season when injuries come? That's the question. And here on the Locked On Jets podcast, there are some other things that will determine success or failure for the Jets this year. They fall in 2 categories: the things you can control and the things you can't control. We'll talk about them as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Yahoo Fantasy. Fantasy football is back. Fire up the group chat, get your draft board ready, and buckle up for a season filled with breakouts, busts, and all the overreactions we live for. It's going down on Yahoo Fantasy. And this year, me and Locked On Jets are playing on Yahoo Fantasy, and you should too, whether you're a first-timer or a veteran making your millionth league. I've played Yahoo Fantasy for over 2 decades. I love how smooth the draft day experience is. And to celebrate 28 years of fantasy greatness, Yahoo Fantasy is dropping 28 big new features over 28 days, giving you more ways to play, more ways to draft, and more ways to win. And it all begins August 4th. Stay tuned and get started by creating or joining a Yahoo Fantasy Football League at yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. That's yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. And let's make this fantasy season the best one yet. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. Once again, a big shout out to you everydayers. We're talking about the 2025 New York Jets today. We've talked about reasons the roster should give you optimism, reasons the roster should maybe give you a little pessimism, but there are going to be things beyond just the overall talent level on the roster that will determine whether this season's ultimately a success or not for the New York Jets. And there are 2 categories of these things. One is the things you can control, and the other are the things you can't control. So what can the Jets control? Well, you want to play fundamentally sound football. And I don't want to like go overboard praising Aaron Glenn. Now, I have to tell you, like, it's been a long time since a first-year coach has won me over to this extent where I'm actively rooting for him. I mean, look, I always root for the Jets coach, but I genuinely like Aaron Glenn's approach. So I'm never going to declare somebody a great coach before they've coached their first game, and I don't know for sure whether Glenn is going to be successful or not here, but I'm really rooting for him just because I just like him. I really like his approach to a lot of things. I like the way he interacts with the media. So I'm really hoping it works out. And of course, I hope it works out for every Jets coach. But I can't remember another Jets coach that I just liked this much this early in his tenure. And one of the things I like is that if you're following training camp, you're seeing a lot about how the Jets are having some pretty intense tackling drills. Now, I've heard a couple people say, oh boy, well, the Jets look worn out in November, December. Everyone's going to be criticizing this, saying Glenn wore the players out. And of course, that's probably what people will do. But I like the fact that they're having a more intense type of training camp. And this isn't about, old school, like, oh, the guy should be hitting. It's not about that. The reason I like it is I think that these training camps and the exhibition season have kind of gone to an extreme where, maybe 30, 40 years ago, we were at a different extreme. We're at this extreme where they were demanding too much of the players, where you actually could wear players out because you were practicing 2 times a day. Guys were hitting nonstop left and right. Like 30, 40 years ago, you could wear a team out during training camp and that could impact the team down the stretch. These days, camp is much lighter. You only practice once a day. There really isn't a ton of like true hitting. There's a fear about players getting hurt. Players have also negotiated new rules in training camp where they have to limit what activities they can do. But by all accounts, the Jets are running a tougher camp this year, and they're focusing more on tackling than most teams do in this league. I think that's a good thing because all you have to do is like look at your typical week 1, week 2 game in this league the last couple of years. Teams are always really sloppy in this, and particularly in their tackling technique. So I think anything that will make your team sharper could be a really positive thing. And it's the type of thing that maybe it helps you steal a game or two early in the season. Maybe you make a tackle in a key spot where you wouldn't make the tackle if your team hadn't been preparing. See, like the thing is, a tough training camp today, a really tough training camp today would have been the easiest training camp by far 30, 40 years ago. So I don't really buy the idea. I know that'll be the narrative if it seems like the Jets are wearing down. I know people will say, oh, Glenn wore them down with the training camp that was too tough. I really doubt this training camp is too tough, though. And it's the type of thing that you want your team to play smart. You want your team to play fundamentally sound. You want your team to tackle effectively. And one of the things, if you are undermanned, and if you do suffer an injury at one of those key spots we were talking about earlier, you don't want to beat yourself. When you take the field as the underdog, you need to play better than your opponent. Jets are going to be underdogs in a number of games this year. Jets aren't going to be underdogs in every game. I think the talent level's a little underrated, but it's not league-leading talent level. It's a kind of a, maybe more of a middle-of-the-pack type talent level on this team right now. And when you're playing against teams that are better, you can't beat yourself. If the other team's better than you, that means you got to play your A game and hope they play their B game. Playing your A game means being smart, means playing disciplined, it means not committing dumb penalties. It means tackling effectively. And these are the things the Jets can control. Then there are the things you can't control. And there's a lot of luck involved in any NFL season. At the top of the show, I talked about how there are teams that are definitely going to be good. And, I mentioned Kansas City as one of them. I think we could throw Buffalo in there. I think we could throw Baltimore in there. But there's a pretty big caveat. That's only if the quarterbacks stay healthy. And if anything happens to one of those quarterbacks, any of those teams could have a rough season. So it's not really, so I have to correct myself a little bit when I said that, those teams are going to be good no matter what, because there's a pretty big no matter what out there. That's quarterback health. And on a bigger level, not every injury impacts your team as much as the quarterback, but injuries do matter. And the hope has to be that and again, this is a Jets team where they don't have a lot of depth, so this is truer of the Jets than it is a lot of other teams. You just have to hope you avoid injuries. Now, part of it is, the old classic cliche, the difference between playing through pain and playing through an injury. And Glenn, I think, being a Bill Parcells disciple, will certainly preach that to his team. But you have to hope that you have good injury luck. And, maybe you get a game. And one of the things I always say when the schedule comes out is we can like guess who we think the easy games are going to be. We can guess who we think the tough games are going to be, but we never know with 100% certainty because there may be some team that you thought was going to be really good that suffers a quarterback injury and you get them on the back end of the season and it ends up being a relatively easy game. And sometimes that happens. And then the other aspect of this are just, a lot of games, more games than we want to admit, do come down to luck. It comes down to like, does a fumble bounce into your guy's arms or the other guy's arms? Come down to, and you'll agree with this, comes down to, do we get a bad flag thrown against us? Do we get a bad call going against us? I think, Jets fans have seen their share of bad calls go against the Jets in key spots. Are the Jets doomed to never get a good call in a big spot? Well, no, we've seen calls go the Jets' way. So you just hope that, and these are the things you can't control. You can't really control injuries. You can't really control, how the ball bounces. There's certain aspects of this league that are lucky. Over half the games are decided by one score. Well, in one score games, there may be like 5-6 plays that decide things, and couple of those plays may just come down to dumb luck. And the difference between a 7-10 season and a 10-7 season are those handful of bounces of the ball. That's the way it works. But for a team like the Jets, where big things aren't expected, that's actually a good thing. Because if this Jets team has 7-10 talent, they're just a couple of bounces away from potentially being 10-7, maybe even making the playoffs. Well, we can all dream, can't we? But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody, and send in your mailbag questions. Tomorrow we'll do our weekly mailbag. Can't wait to answer your questions.